Number 10. Yi Sun Sin. Some commanders become legendary because they conquered vast empires, but others become legendary because they stood at the edge of collapse and refused to let disaster finish its work. Yi Sun Sin belongs to that rarer and more unsettling category of military greatness. An admiral of Joseon Korea during the Imjin War, he is remembered not simply as a naval commander, but as a figure whose discipline, intelligence, and refusal to yield transformed maritime defense into something almost mythic. That is what gives him such enduring force. He did not build his legend by marching at the head of endless conquest. He built it by holding the line so brilliantly that the sea itself seemed to become part of his command. What makes Yi Sun Sin so powerful in historical memory is the scale of composure attached to his name. War often rewards speed, fury, and overwhelming force, yet Yi's reputation survives through something colder and, in a different way, more frightening: control. Fleet movement, terrain, timing, formation, morale, and tactical adaptation all converged in a commander whose victories seemed to emerge not from chaos, but from a near-impossible mastery of it. That quality matters because history fears minds that can remain clear while everything around them is burning. An army can dread a brutal conqueror, but it dreads something different in a commander who appears to see more of the battlefield than anyone else, and who turns apparent weakness into a trap. The sea amplifies that fear even further. Naval war already carries a special psychological weight because the environment itself is unstable, merciless, and limiting. On land, an army may retreat into forests, hills, or fortified routes. At sea, movement is exposed, decisions are compressed, and error becomes fatal very quickly. Yi Sun Sin thrived in that world. That is part of what made him so haunting to enemies and so revered by those he defended. He did not merely fight on the water, he made the water answer his strategy. Once that reputation takes hold, a commander becomes more than a military opponent. He becomes an atmosphere of inevitability. What keeps Yi Sun Sin unforgettable is that he represents one of the most intimidating forms of command in all military history. Defensive brilliance so absolute that it begins to feel invincible. He remains powerful not because his story is soaked in theatrical cruelty, but because it proves something perhaps more unnerving. A disciplined mind under pressure in the right conditions can become as terrifying as any conqueror. Yi turned battle into legend because he showed that greatness in war does not always arrive as expansion. Sometimes it arrives as refusal, precision, and the cold destruction of anyone who mistakes restraint for weakness. Number 9. Napoleon Bonaparte. Some commanders become legendary because they terrify through barbaric scale, but others do so because they make war feel intellectual, theatrical, and unstoppable all at once. Napoleon Bonaparte belongs to that darker category of military force. More than almost any commander in modern history, he became a symbol of battlefield genius fused with political ambition so large that Europe itself seemed to revolve around his campaigns. That is what gives him such enduring power. He was not just a general winning battles. He became a figure whose very movement across the map altered the mental climate of an age. Kingdoms recalculated, coalitions formed, borders trembled, and the name Napoleon became shorthand for both brilliance and catastrophe. What makes Napoleon so powerful in historical memory is the velocity of his transformation. He rose not through dynastic inheritance, but through war, and once war made him visible, he seemed to operate at a scale that blurred the line between commander and historical event. Victories became part of a larger myth of inevitability, as though he had discovered how to accelerate war beyond the pace at which older powers could respond. That is often what makes a commander truly frightening. It is not just that he defeats armies, it is that he forces everyone around him to feel late. Napoleon repeatedly created that sensation. He seemed faster than councils, faster than hesitation, faster than the political systems trying to contain him. At the same time, his legend survives because it carries grandeur and ruin in equal measure. History rarely preserves military figures so vividly, unless their victories also cast unusually long shadows. Napoleon's campaigns were not frightening only because of tactical brilliance. They were frightening because brilliance on that scale expands appetite. The commander who wins too often begins to wager entire continents. That is where admiration darkens into dread. An extraordinary war leader stops looking like a defender of order and begins to resemble a force consuming order in order to remake it under his own image. Napoleon reached exactly that point. He became terrifying because genius no longer seemed bounded by proportion. What keeps Napoleon haunting is that he reveals one of history's most dangerous truths about command. Military brilliance can become a form of destiny performance, and once a man begins to believe himself equal to history, the battlefield grows far larger than battle. He turned war into legend because he made it seem like the supreme instrument of personal will. Even his defeats did not erase that. They enlarged it. He remains unforgettable because he embodies the paradox. History never resolves comfortably, that a commander may be admired for mastery even as that same mastery pushes whole worlds toward exhaustion, fire, and collapse. Number 8. Vlad the Impaler. Some commanders become legendary because they won against impossible odds, but others become legendary because they understood that fear itself could be sharpened into a weapon more devastating than steel. Vlad the Impaler belongs to that darker category of military power. Ruler of Wallachia, and one of the most infamous figures in European history, he survives not simply as a prince or war leader, but as a name fused with terror, punishment, and the deliberate staging of horror. That is what gives him such enduring force. Vlad did not rely only on battlefield success. He built his reputation by making the enemy imagine what awaited them before the battle had even begun. What makes Vlad so powerful in historical memory is the theatrical cruelty attached to his rule. Many commanders killed, many rulers punished. But Vlad's legacy endures because violence under him seemed designed not merely to eliminate opposition, but to send a message so unforgettable that it could travel farther than armies. In his story, punishment becomes spectacle. War becomes psychological occupation. The battlefield no longer begins at the clash of forces. It begins in rumor, in dread, in the sight of what happens to those who resist. That is a distinctly terrifying form of command because it turns the mind of the enemy into conquered territory before the campaign is even decided. At the same time, Vlad's reputation exists at the unstable border between history, propaganda, and legend. His enemies had every reason to amplify his brutality, and later retellings eagerly transformed him into something almost inhuman. But that does not weaken his power in the record. It deepens it. The fact that his memory survives through both documented severity and demonized exaggeration means he became larger than ordinary political violence. He entered the realm of symbolic fear. Once that happens, a ruler no longer exists only as a historical figure. He becomes a warning, a nightmare image preserved by both enemies and fascinated descendants. What keeps Vlad the Impaler haunting is that he represents one of the most disturbing forms of military authority, command exercised through deliberate moral shock. He turned battle into legend because he understood that terror could function as strategy, that a ruler could wound not only bodies, but imagination, and that once fear acquired a face, resistance itself might begin to weaken. Vlad remains unforgettable because history does not remember him merely as a prince defending a threatened land. It remembers him as a man who made cruelty feel methodical enough to become part of the architecture of war. Number 7. Joan of Arc. Some commanders become legendary because they terrified through brutality, but others become legendary because they introduced something more destabilizing into war than slaughter alone. Conviction so intense that it altered the morale of armies and the imagination of nations. Joan of Arc belongs to that rarer and more unsettling category of military power. A peasant girl who rose into the heart of the 100 Years' War and became inseparable from French resistance, She was terrifying not because she resembled the warlords around her, but because she did not. That is what gives her such enduring force. Joan's power was not built on dynastic inheritance, personal armies, or the long cultivation of political fear. It was built on belief, and belief in war can be more dangerous than numbers. What makes Joan so powerful in historical memory is the impossible shape of her ascent. She entered a world of armored hierarchy, noble command, and exhausted conflict carrying authority that should have been dismissed instantly, yet somehow was not. That alone made her destabilizing. Enemies could understand an ambitious prince or a seasoned captain. A young woman claiming divine guidance and then standing near the center of military transformation was something far harder to absorb. Once victories and momentum began attaching themselves to her presence, Joan ceased to be merely unusual. She became a rupture in the logic of the age, and that is exactly the kind of figure history cannot forget. Her legend survives because she made war feel charged with meaning beyond strategy. Around many commanders gather stories of tactics and discipline. Around Joan gathered purpose. She represented not just an army in motion, but a cause suddenly illuminated by destiny, and that can be terrifying to anyone facing it. An opponent may hope to outmaneuver force, but conviction that appears blessed, pure, and unbroken creates a different psychological threat. It suggests that morale itself has found a body. That is why Joan became so powerful so quickly. She made soldiers feel that defeat was no longer inevitable, and made enemies confront a figure who seemed to draw power from somewhere outside ordinary military logic. What keeps Joan of Arc haunting is that she reveals one of history's deepest truths about battle. War is not shaped only by steel and command structure, but by symbol, faith, and the dangerous energy of collective belief focused through one person. She turned battle into legend because she made the battlefield feel watched by history, by God, by destiny, or at least by the idea of destiny. Even her death did not diminish that. It completed it. Joan remains unforgettable because she stands at the point where military leadership becomes sanctified in memory, and that is one of the most powerful and frightening transformations any commander can undergo. Number 6. Saladin. Some commanders become legendary because they spread fear through devastation, but others do something more complicated and, in its own way, just as powerful. They make enemies fear not only their strength, but their discipline, legitimacy, and ability to embody an entire cause. Saladin belongs to that rarer category of military greatness. Sultan, unifier, and commander during the Crusades, he survives in historical memory not merely as a warrior, but as a figure whose presence seemed to gather fractured power into purpose. That is what gives him such enduring force. Saladin did not become legendary by acting like a brute outside history. He became legendary by acting as though history itself had chosen him to restore, consolidate, and strike. What makes Saladin so powerful in the record is the breadth of his authority. He was not simply a battlefield tactician isolated from politics, religion, and dynastic pressure. He moved across all of them at once. Armies matter more when they appear to serve something larger than plunder, and Saladin's strength came in part from making war feel inseparable from civilizational recovery and sacred obligation. That changes the emotional climate of conflict. An enemy may fear a violent commander, but it fears something different in a leader whose campaigns seem morally organized, whose victories appear to restore order rather than merely destroy it, and whose name begins to symbolize patience before triumph. That is part of why Saladin became so difficult to reduce. He did not simply attack, he represented return. His legend also survives because he occupies a rare place in the historical imagination, feared by opponents and yet respected by many of them. That kind of memory is hard to achieve. It usually belongs only to commanders whose personal character and strategic effectiveness fuse into something larger than factional hatred. Saladin's image carries severity, religious seriousness, restraint and power held under control, and in war that can be more intimidating than chaos. A savage conqueror may inspire horror, but a composed and principled enemy capable of defeating you while still appearing morally grounded inspires a more unsettling kind of fear. It suggests not only that you may lose, but that history may judge the loss as deserved. What keeps Saladin haunting is that he reveals one of the most formidable forms of command in all military history, the ability to make battle feel purposeful enough to become destiny. He turned war into legend because he embodied more than strategy. He embodied a reclamation. The armies under him were not merely moving men and steel. They were moving inside a narrative powerful enough to outlast the campaign itself. That is why his memory remains so strong. Saladin stands at the point where the commander becomes inseparable from the cause, and once that happens, every victory feels larger than war alone. Number 5. Attila the Hun. Some commanders become legendary because they are admired for brilliance, but others become legendary because their name itself begins to function like an omen. Attila the Hun belongs to that darker and more apocalyptic category of military power. More than almost any warlord of late antiquity, he survives not simply as a ruler of mounted warriors, but as a figure whose approach seemed to announce fire, collapse, tribute, and panic before battle even began. That is what gives him such enduring force. Attila did not need to be remembered as subtle in order to become unforgettable. He became terrifying because he made entire political worlds feel exposed. What makes Attila so powerful in historical memory is the scale of fear concentrated into mobility. Empires are often most vulnerable, not when they face static enemies, but when they face forces capable of moving faster than bureaucracy, diplomacy, and regional defense can comfortably absorb. Attila's legend feeds on that instability. Horsemen, sudden violence, tribute extracted under pressure, cities threatened, and the sense of a frontier no longer holding create exactly the kind of atmosphere from which history produces scourges. Once such a reputation forms, the commander becomes more than a military opponent. He becomes a test of whether an empire still deserves to believe in its own permanence. That fear was amplified by the way Roman and later Christian memory framed him. Attila was not merely dangerous in military terms. He became symbolically dangerous, a figure onto whom the age projected anxieties about divine punishment, civilizational weakness, and the fragility of order. That matters because the most enduring military legends are rarely preserved by logistics alone. They are preserved by what societies feel they are confronting when they face the commander. In Attila's case, many did not feel they were only facing a rival ruler. They felt they were facing catastrophe in human form. Whether that image exaggerates the man is less important than what the exaggeration reveals. His enemies had to imagine him as more than ordinary in order to explain the scale of their fear. What keeps Attila haunting is that he represents one of the oldest and most terrifying military archetypes, the warlord who arrives from beyond the settled world and makes settlement itself feel temporary. He turned battle into legend because he carried with him not only violence, but the suggestion that borders, walls, and imperial confidence could all fail at once. Attila remains unforgettable because his story is less about one campaign than about the emotional collapse that can occur when a civilization begins to see its enemy not as a state among states, but as the rider of its own approaching reckoning. Number 4. Subutai. Some commanders become legendary because they ruled empires directly, but others became even more terrifying because they seemed to turn war itself into a machine that could move across continents without losing speed. Subutai belongs to that darker category of military genius. He was not the founder of the Mongol world, and he did not need to be. His power came from something more unsettling, the ability to take the destructive momentum of empire and give it direction so precise that entire regions appeared to fall in sequence beneath his planning. That is what gives him such enduring force. Subutai did not simply ride with conquest. He organized it, extended it, and made it feel as though distance itself had stopped protecting anyone. What makes Subutai so powerful in historical memory is the coldness of his effectiveness. Many war leaders are remembered through personal ferocity, battlefield charisma, or visible theatrical dominance. Subutai feels different. He survives as a mind, a strategist whose campaigns suggest an almost inhuman capacity to coordinate movement, intelligence, timing, and multi-front pressure across enormous spaces. That is often what makes a commander most frightening. Not rage, but clarity. Not spectacle, but inevitability. Enemies facing such a figure do not simply fear defeat in one encounter. They begin to fear being drawn into a design already unfolding beyond their field of vision. That sense of scale is central to his legend. Under Subutai, war no longer feels local. It becomes continental. Rivers, mountains, kingdoms, and alliances cease to function as reliable barriers when the enemy can study, adapt, divide, and return from unexpected directions. This is one of the deepest military terrors in history. The realization that what looks like a frontier may already have been turned into a route. Subutai's reputation survives because he made that terror real. He showed that the battlefield did not have to be a single place. It could become an entire geography rearranged around one commander's ability to think farther than everyone opposing him. What keeps Subutai haunting is that he represents one of the most unnerving forms of command ever seen. Intelligence weaponized at imperial scale. He turned battle into legend because he made strategy feel larger than courage, larger than walls, and sometimes larger than the political imagination of the states trying to stop him. He remains unforgettable because history rarely produces minds that can make conquest appear less like a series of victories and more like a spreading pattern from which there may be no escape once it has begun. Number 3. Belisarius. Some commanders become legendary because they spread terror through conquest. But others do something more difficult and, in its own way, even more impressive. They restore power that seemed already lost. Belisarius belongs to that rarer and more haunting category of military greatness. General of the Byzantine Empire under Justinian, he is remembered not merely as a successful commander, but as a man who repeatedly took forces too small, circumstances too difficult, and frontiers too unstable, then forced history to watch him win anyway. That is what gives him such enduring force. Belisarius did not simply expand, he recovered. And recovery in war can feel more uncanny than conquest, because it makes ruin itself appear reversible. What makes Belisarius so powerful in historical memory is the contrast between means and result. Many great conquerors inspire awe because they move with overwhelming numbers or vast momentum. Belisarius often seems to do the opposite. He appears at the edge of imperial weakness and somehow imposes order through discipline, tactical brilliance, adaptability, and personal authority. That is a different kind of fear from the one inspired by a ravaging warlord. It is the fear of a commander who can turn inferior conditions into advantage and who repeatedly refuses to let collapse become final. Against such a figure, victory becomes psychologically exhausting because even success against him may feel temporary. His legend also survives because he embodies one of the most dramatic military fantasies in all of history, the restoration of empire by force of command. Campaigns in North Africa, Italy, and beyond helped make him into more than a general. He became a vehicle through which Rome, or at least the memory of Rome, seemed to rise again in altered form. That symbolic dimension matters. Commanders become unforgettable when they carry not only weapons, but historical longing. Belisarius did exactly that. He did not merely win battles. He made soldiers and subjects believe that imperial destiny could still be summoned back from fragmentation. What keeps Belisarius haunting is that he reveals how terrifying disciplined excellence can become when it serves a state trying to reclaim the world it once lost. He turned battle into legend because he made recovery look possible under conditions where it should have failed. He remains unforgettable not through cruelty or apocalyptic destruction, but through a quieter and more intellectually unnerving power, the ability to make history reverse direction under pressure. That kind of command can feel almost supernatural to those forced to confront it, because it suggests that decline itself may not be safe while such a man is still in the field. Number 2. Genghis Khan. Some commanders become legendary because they mastered battle, but others become legendary because they made battle only one part of a much larger force, a force that could erase borders, crush kingdoms, and turn the known world into a map of advancing fear. Genghis Khan belongs to that highest and darkest category of military power. Founder of the Mongol Empire, he survives in history not simply as a conqueror, but as a figure whose rise altered the scale on which conquest itself could be imagined. That is what gives him such enduring force. He did not merely defeat armies, he reorganized war into something faster, harsher, and vastly more expansive than the civilizations around him were prepared to endure. What makes Genghis Khan so powerful in historical memory is the fusion of mobility, discipline, and terror. Many warlords were brutal, many generals were brilliant, and many rulers dreamed of empire, but Genghis combined these elements in a way that made resistance feel not only dangerous, but often futile. Under him, cavalry ceased to be a tactical arm and became the bloodstream of an imperial storm. Intelligence, adaptability, speed, deception, and collective discipline all moved together with such effectiveness that settled powers repeatedly found themselves confronting not just invasion, but a military logic they had not fully learned how to stop. That is often what makes a commander most terrifying. He does not merely attack existing systems, he exposes that they were never built for him. The fear attached to Genghis Khan was also amplified by the scale of consequence that followed in his wake. Cities were taken, populations shattered, political orders broken, and the psychological effect of Mongol advance often travelled ahead of the army itself. This matters because military legends grow strongest when violence becomes atmospheric. Once enough destruction is linked to one name, that name begins to function like a weapon long before the battle begins. Genghis reached that level. He became terrifying not only because of what he did in one campaign, but because his presence suggested that entire worlds could be folded into conquest one after another without any natural stopping point. In such a figure, war stops feeling episodic. It starts feeling historical. What keeps Genghis Khan haunting is that he represents one of the most complete transformations of battle into civilizational force ever seen. He turned war into legend because he made conquest seem as though it had discovered its purest form, movement without hesitation, command without softness, and ambition without regional limit. He remains unforgettable because history rarely produces a leader whose victories are so immense that even centuries later the name still carries both awe and dread. Genghis Khan survives not just as a commander, but as proof that one man, given the right conditions and the right will, can turn the violence of war into a reshaping of the world. Number 1. Hannibal Barca. Some commanders become legendary because they won the most territory, some because they inspired the most fear, and some because they achieved something even more enduring. They made military genius feel so personal, so audacious, and so improbable that history could never stop retelling it. Hannibal Barca stands at number 1 because no other commander on this list so perfectly fuses strategic brilliance, psychological terror, endurance, and near-mythic battlefield identity into one unforgettable figure. Carthaginian general and Rome's great nightmare, Hannibal is remembered not simply for fighting a powerful enemy, but for carrying war directly into the imagination of a civilization that would define much of the ancient world. That is what gives him unmatched force. He did not merely challenge Rome, he made Rome afraid. What makes Hannibal so powerful in historical memory is the way he seemed to turn impossibility into method. The march across the Alps alone was enough to ensure immortality, because it represented the kind of audacity that forces enemies to understand that ordinary assumptions have already failed. But Hannibal's legend did not rest on spectacle alone. It rested on what followed. Tactical brilliance, relentless adaptability, the manipulation of terrain, the reading of enemy weakness, and the transformation of battlefield space into carefully arranged destruction all converged in a commander whose victories felt not accidental, but intellectually devastating. Against Hannibal, defeat did not feel like bad luck. It felt like being understood too well by the man trying to destroy you. That is why his presence terrified Rome so deeply. Rome could face enemies. What it struggled to face was an enemy commander who repeatedly shattered Roman confidence in the normal logic of war. Hannibal did not simply kill soldiers. He attacked the Roman belief in its own inevitable superiority. That is a rarer and more profound military threat than physical defeat alone. A civilization can replace legions. It is harder to replace certainty once it has been broken often enough by the same mind. Hannibal's victories, especially at Cannae, became more than battles. They became lessons in how completely a commander can dismantle a larger force through design, patience, and timing. That is the kind of greatness history both admires and fears most. What makes Hannibal worthy of the #1 place is that he represents battle at its most legendary, not because he conquered the entire world, but because he made command itself feel like an art of terrifying precision. He turned war into legend because his campaigns still read like the work of someone operating half a step beyond the imagination of his opponents. Even in ultimate strategic failure against Rome's long endurance, his aura survived intact, perhaps even strengthened by the tragic shape of the story. Hannibal remains unforgettable because he embodies the commander as nightmare genius, the enemy whose victories become immortal not just for what they destroyed, but for how perfectly they were conceived. In him, battle stops being only violence between armies. It becomes the visible expression of a mind so dangerous that history has never quite found a way to stop fearing it.